Elena Marsh pressed her back against the cold stone wall and held her breath as two guards marched past, close enough that she could hear the creak of their boots. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain it would give her away. She was not supposed to be here. No one like her was supposed to be here. Yet here she stood, tucked behind a tall hedge just inside the palace courtyard, about to watch something she had only ever dreamed about. The whole city of Ashbourne had been talking about this day for weeks. Duke Alistair Whitmore, the most powerful man in the region after the king himself, was about to be formally confirmed in his title before the entire court. Grand carriages had rolled through the streets since dawn, carrying nobles in silk and velvet, their faces proud and untouched by the kind of hunger that Elena knew all too well. She was the daughter of a seamstress, a girl who mended hems and stitched buttons for coins that barely stretched to cover bread and coal. She had no business anywhere near a royal ceremony, and yet she had come anyway. It started as a small thought, the kind that creeps in during a long, tired evening. She had heard the Duke's name spoken so many times in the market, in hushed and reverent tones, that she had begun to wonder what kind of man could inspire both fear and admiration in the same breath. Some called him cold, others called him fair. A few, mostly older women who had known his family for years, called him lonely, though they never explained what they meant by it. Elena wanted to see for herself, just once. She told herself that after today, she would go back to her ordinary life and never think of grand ceremonies again. She had slipped through a gate meant for deliveries, following a cart of flowers destined for the courtyard, and no one had questioned a girl in a plain brown dress, carrying an empty basket. It was almost too easy. Now she crouched behind the hedge, peering through the leaves at a scene so bright and gleaming it did not seem real. Banners in gold and deep blue hung from every pillar. Rows of chairs, each one more finely carved than any piece of furniture Elena had ever touched, filled the courtyard in perfect lines. At the front stood a raised platform where the ceremony would take place, and beside it, a table draped in cloth, so white it hurt to look at in the morning sun. Trumpets sounded from somewhere near the palace gates, and a hush fell over the gathered crowd. Elena's pulse quickened. She leaned forward just slightly, careful not to rustle the hedge, and watched as the doors of the great hall opened. He came out first, before the officials, before the guards even settled into their positions. Duke Alistair Whitmore walked with the kind of steady, unhurried pace that made everyone else in the courtyard seem to be moving too fast by comparison. He wore a deep blue coat lined with silver thread, and his dark hair was combed back neatly, though a single strand had already escaped and fallen across his forehead. He did not smile. He did not wave to the crowd the way Elena had imagined a nobleman might. He simply walked to his place at the center of the platform, and stood there, his expression unreadable, his eyes fixed somewhere beyond the crowd entirely. Elena found herself studying his face longer than she meant to. There was something in his eyes that did not match the grandeur around him, something tired and distant, as if he were standing in a room full of strangers even though every person present had come specifically to honor him. She wondered, briefly, what it must be like to have an entire kingdom watching you and still feel completely alone. A guard shifted near the edge of the courtyard, and Elena's attention snapped back to her surroundings. She had almost forgotten where she was. She pressed herself lower behind the hedge, scolding herself silently for getting so lost in watching a stranger's face that she nearly forgot the danger of being caught. If anyone found her here, uninvited and unannounced, there was no telling what would happen. She might be dragged out in front of everyone, humiliated before the very people she had come to admire from a distance. Or worse, her mother might hear of it, and there would be no explaining her way out of that conversation. But she could not make herself leave. Not yet. The officiant, an older man in long white robes trimmed with gold, stepped forward and began to speak in a booming voice that carried across the entire courtyard. He spoke of duty and honor, of the responsibility that came with the Duke's title, of the long line of Whitmores who had served the region faithfully for generations. Elena only half listened to the words. She was watching the Duke instead, watching the way his jaw tightened slightly whenever the officiant mentioned his father, watching the way his hands remained perfectly still at his sides, even as everyone around him seemed to be holding their breath in anticipation. A guard named Edmund, a broad-shouldered man with sharp eyes who had been posted near the outer wall, had noticed something out of place several minutes earlier, a flash of brown fabric behind the hedge, a shape that did not belong among the neatly trimmed shrubs and stone statues. At first he thought it might be a servant who had wandered too close, someone easily sent back to their proper post with a quiet word. He began to make his way along the edge of the courtyard, moving carefully so as not to disturb the ceremony, his eyes fixed on the hedge where he had seen the movement. Elena had no idea she was being watched. She was too absorbed in the scene before her, in the strange pull she felt toward a man she had never met, and would likely never speak to. The officiant's voice rose as he reached the heart of his speech, declaring that the moment had come for Duke Alistair Whitmore to take his formal oath before the court and before the people of Ashbourne. A rustle of anticipation moved through the crowd. Nobles leaned forward in their seats. Even the birds seemed to quiet themselves, as if sensing the importance of the moment. The Duke stepped forward to the edge of the platform, and for the first time since he had appeared, something shifted in his posture. He lifted his chin slightly, preparing to speak the words that would be recorded in the history of the region for generations to come. Elena felt a strange flutter in her chest, a sense that she was witnessing something far bigger than herself, something she would remember for the rest of her life, even if no one ever knew she had been there to see it. That was when it happened. As the Duke turned his head slightly to face the officiant, his gaze drifted, just for a moment, past the rows of seated nobles, past the guards standing at attention, and landed on the hedge where Elena crouched. Their eyes met. It lasted only a heartbeat, perhaps less, but Elena felt it as though the entire courtyard had gone silent around them. She froze, certain that she had imagined it, certain that a man like the Duke of Ashbourne could not possibly notice a girl hiding in the shadows of a hedge during the most important ceremony of his life. But he had noticed. She could see it in the way his expression changed, the way his eyes widened just slightly before he caught himself and schooled his features back into calm composure. Something about her face had struck him, had pulled his attention away from the ceremony itself, away from the officiant's booming voice, away from the hundreds of eyes fixed upon him. The officiant, unaware of what had just happened, continued speaking, moving toward the final and most important part of the oath. He asked the Duke to step forward and place his hand upon the ceremonial seal, the symbol of his new authority, and to speak the words that would bind him to his title for the rest of his life. The Duke did not move. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The officiant paused, glancing up from his scroll with visible confusion. Nobles in the front rows exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether this was some part of the ceremony they had simply forgotten about, some tradition that called for a moment of silent reflection before the final oath. But the guards near the platform, trained to notice even the smallest deviation from protocol, tensed at their posts, their hands instinctively moving toward the hilts of their swords, though they had no idea what threat, if any, they were meant to respond to. Duke Alistair Whitmore stood perfectly still, his eyes still fixed on the hedge at the edge of the courtyard, on the girl in the plain brown dress, who had frozen in place, too frightened to run and too stunned to look away. "Wait," he said. The single word cut through the silence like a struck bell. It was not loud, but it carried across the courtyard with a weight that made every person present sit up straighter in their seats. The officiant blinked, his mouth opening slightly, as though he could not quite believe what he had heard. In all the years he had officiated ceremonies for the Whitmore family, no one had ever interrupted their own investiture. It simply was not done. "Your Grace," the officiant said carefully, uncertain how to proceed. But the Duke did not answer him. His eyes remained fixed on the hedge, on Elena, who by now had realized there was no possible way to remain hidden any longer. Every eye in the courtyard was beginning to follow the direction of the Duke's gaze, and within seconds, hundreds of nobles turned in their seats to see what had captured his attention so completely. Elena's stomach dropped. She wanted more than anything to disappear, to sink into the ground and vanish before anyone could see her properly. But it was too late. The guard named Edmund, who had been quietly approaching from the side, reached the hedge at almost the same moment the Duke's gaze had settled there, and he reached out a hand toward her arm, prepared to escort her away before she could cause any further disruption. "No," the Duke said, and this time his voice was louder, firm enough that Edmund froze mid-motion, his hand still hovering near Elena's sleeve. "Let her be." A wave of astonished whispers swept through the courtyard. Nobles turned to one another, murmuring questions no one could answer. Who was this girl? Why had the Duke stopped the ceremony for her? Lord Reginald, the Duke's most trusted advisor, who had been seated near the front of the platform, rose halfway from his chair, his brow furrowed with concern he did not bother to hide. He had known Alistair Whitmore since the young Duke was a boy, and never once in all those years had he seen him abandon protocol so completely, so publicly, without a word of explanation. The Duke stepped down from the platform. Gasps rippled through the crowd as he moved, his blue coat catching the morning light, his expression no longer distant but sharp with focus, as though he had suddenly remembered something he had spent years trying to recall. He walked past the officiant, past the ceremonial seal that had been prepared for his oath, past rows of stunned nobles who had traveled from every corner of the region to witness his confirmation. He walked toward the hedge, toward the guard who still stood frozen with his hand extended, and toward the girl who stood there in her plain brown dress, looking as though she wished the earth would swallow her whole. Elena wanted to run. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to turn and flee back through the service gate she had entered through, to disappear into the crowded streets of Ashbourne where no one would ever think to look for a seamstress's daughter. But her legs refused to move. She stood rooted to the spot, watching the most powerful man in the region approach her with an intensity in his eyes that she could not begin to understand. The courtyard had gone completely silent now, save for the soft rustle of the hedge and the distant call of a bird somewhere beyond the palace walls. Every noble, every guard, every servant standing at the edges of the courtyard held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The officiant remained on the platform, his scroll still open in his hands, utterly unsure of how to proceed with a ceremony that had, quite suddenly and quite publicly, come to a complete stop. Duke Alistair Whitmore stopped a few feet from Elena and studied her face, the way a man studies something he has been searching for without knowing it, something he had almost given up hope of ever finding. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncertain, while hundreds of eyes watched from every direction, waiting to understand what had just changed in the span of a single heartbeat. Elena finally found her voice, though it came out barely above a whisper. "Your Grace," she said, dropping into an awkward, hurried curtsy, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. "I am so sorry. I did not mean to disturb anything. I will leave at once." But the Duke did not step aside to let her pass. He remained exactly where he was, his gaze still fixed on her face, as though he was afraid that if he looked away, even for a moment, she might vanish entirely, and whatever thread of memory he had just grasped would slip through his fingers forever. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice quieter now, meant only for her, though in the stillness of the courtyard, everyone nearby could still hear every word. Elena hesitated. She glanced past him, at the sea of stunned faces watching from the rows of chairs, at Lord Reginald, standing now with his arms crossed and his expression darkening by the second, at the officiant, still frozen on the platform with his ceremonial scroll hanging forgotten in his hand. She had never meant to become the center of attention. She had only wanted to watch from a distance, to see the pageantry and the grandeur just once, before returning to her quiet, ordinary life. "Elena," she said finally, her voice trembling slightly. "Elena Marsh." Something flickered across the Duke's face when she said her name, a mixture of recognition and disbelief that he seemed to be struggling to contain. He opened his mouth as though he wanted to say something more, something important, but before he could speak, the officiant cleared his throat loudly from the platform, clearly hoping to draw the ceremony back to its intended path. "Your Grace," the officiant called out, his voice strained with poorly hidden panic. "The court awaits your oath." The Duke did not turn around. He kept his eyes on Elena for another long moment, as though weighing something important in his mind, some decision that would change the course of the day, far more than anyone in the courtyard could yet imagine. Then, finally, he spoke, loud enough for the entire courtyard to hear. "The ceremony will resume shortly," he said, "but first, I have a matter that requires my immediate attention." A wave of astonished murmurs swept through the crowd once more. Nobles turned to whisper urgently to one another, guards exchanged uncertain glances, and Lord Reginald took several quick steps toward the edge of the platform, his face now openly troubled. No one in the history of the Whitmore family had ever paused their own investiture for anything, let alone for an unknown girl who had somehow found her way into the courtyard uninvited. Elena stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs, as the Duke turned to Edmund, the guard who had been about to escort her away only moments before. "Bring her to the receiving room," the Duke said, gently. "She is a guest, not a prisoner." Edmund hesitated, glancing toward Lord Reginald as though seeking some kind of permission, but the Duke's tone left no room for argument. With a stiff nod, the guard turned to Elena, his expression far softer now than it had been moments earlier, and gestured for her to follow him toward the palace. Elena looked back once at the Duke before she was led away, and found him still watching her, his expression somewhere between wonder and disbelief, as though he had just witnessed something he had waited years to see, and could hardly believe was real. Behind him, the courtyard buzzed with confusion and speculation, hundreds of voices rising together in a storm of questions that no one yet had the answers to. As Elena walked away from the courtyard, her legs still shaking beneath her, she could not shake the feeling that her quiet, ordinary life had just come to an end, and that whatever waited for her inside the palace walls would change everything she had ever known about who she was and where she belonged. Behind her, the ceremony remained frozen in place, the entire court of Ashbourne left waiting in stunned silence, wondering what could possibly have mattered more to their new duke than the oath that would confirm his power over the region for the rest of his life. Nobody in that courtyard, not the officiant, not Lord Reginald, not even the guards trained to notice every detail, understood yet that the answer to that question was standing quietly in a receiving room deep within the palace, waiting with trembling hands and a racing heart, completely unaware of just how much her life was about to change. The receiving room was unlike anything Elena had ever stood inside. Tall windows let in soft morning light that fell across a polished floor, and the walls were lined with paintings of stern-faced men and women, dressed in fine clothing, their eyes seeming to follow her as she paced back and forth across the room. Edmund had led her here in near silence, offering only a brief nod before positioning himself outside the door, leaving her alone with her racing thoughts and the distant, muffled sound of the courtyard, slowly returning to some semblance of order. She sat down on the edge of a velvet chair, then immediately stood again, unable to keep still. Her mind kept replaying the moment the Duke's eyes had found hers across the courtyard, the way the entire ceremony had stopped because of her, the way hundreds of nobles had turned to stare at a girl in a plain brown dress who had no right to be there at all. She pressed her palms against her cheeks, trying to steady her breathing, wondering if she had somehow imagined the whole thing, if perhaps she would wake up at home in her narrow bed and discover this had all been nothing more than a strange and vivid dream. But the ache in her legs from crouching behind the hedge was real. The soft, unfamiliar fabric of the chair beneath her fingers was real. And the sound of footsteps approaching the door, growing louder with each passing second, was very real indeed. The door opened, and Duke Alistair Whitmore stepped inside. He had changed out of his ceremonial coat, though he still wore clothes far finer than anything Elena had ever seen up close. A simple dark jacket that somehow made him look less like a symbol of power and more like an ordinary man. He closed the door behind him softly, and for a moment, the two of them simply stood there, several feet apart, studying one another in silence. "Please," he said finally, gesturing toward the chair she had abandoned. "Sit. You have nothing to fear here." Elena did not sit. Her hands twisted together in front of her, and she found herself speaking before she could stop the words from tumbling out. "Your Grace, I truly am sorry. I never meant to interrupt your ceremony. I only wanted to see it, just once, from a distance. I will accept whatever you think is fair, but please, do not blame the guards. It was my fault entirely for sneaking in." Something in the Duke's expression softened, and for the first time since she had met his eyes across the courtyard, the corner of his mouth lifted, not quite a smile, but close to one. "You think I brought you here to scold you?" Elena blinked, uncertain how to answer. "I do not know why else you would stop everything for a stranger." The Duke walked slowly toward the window, his hands clasped behind his back, and for a long moment he said nothing, staring out at the courtyard below, where servants were already beginning to reset chairs and rearrange banners that had fallen out of order during the confusion. When he finally spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost hesitant, as though he were unsure how to explain something even to himself. "When I was a boy," he said, "long before I had any title to my name, my father used to send me to stay with distant relatives in the countryside each summer. He believed it built character, spending time away from the comforts of the palace. I hated it at first. I missed my home, and I did not know how to make friends among children who had no idea who my family was. Elena listened, still standing near the chair, unsure why the Duke of Ashbourne was telling her about his childhood summers, but too curious to interrupt. One summer, when I was perhaps 10 years old, I wandered too far from the house where I was staying and found myself near a frozen pond, he continued. I was foolish. I walked out onto the ice without thinking, and it cracked beneath me before I understood the danger I was in. I remember the cold more than anything else, a cold so complete it felt as though it had reached into my very bones. He paused, and Elena felt a strange tightness building in her chest, though she could not have said why. A girl pulled me out, the Duke said, turning to look at her again. A girl about my age, with dark hair and quick hands, who did not hesitate for even a moment before running out onto the ice herself to reach me. She never told me her name. I was too cold and too frightened to think to ask, and by the time I had gathered my senses enough to thank her properly, she had already run off toward the village, likely to fetch help. I never saw her again after that day. Elena's breath caught in her throat. A memory, faint and distant, stirred somewhere in the back of her mind. A memory of ice cracking beneath her boots, of cold water soaking through her sleeves as she reached for a boy she had never met before and would likely never see again. I was young too, she said slowly, almost to herself. My mother used to take me to visit her sister in the countryside during the warmer months, before my aunt passed, and we stopped making the journey. I remember a pond. I remember pulling someone out of the ice once, though it has been so many years I had almost forgotten it entirely. The Duke's eyes widened slightly, and he took a step closer to her, though he stopped himself before closing the distance completely, as though remembering, quite suddenly, the difference in their stations. I have thought of that girl more times than I can count over the years, he said. I never knew her name. I never knew what became of her, and then today, standing on that platform, about to speak words that would bind me to a title I have never fully wanted, I looked out at the crowd and saw your face, and for a moment, I was certain I was looking at her again. Elena did not know what to say. The weight of his words settled over her slowly, and she found herself searching his face for some trace of the boy he must have once been, cold and frightened, pulled from icy water by a girl who had never thought to ask his name, because she had been too busy making sure he was breathing. I cannot say for certain it was me, she admitted quietly. It was so long ago, and I was very young. Perhaps not, the Duke said. But your face, your name, the timing of it all. It feels like more than simple coincidence. And even if I am wrong, even if you are not the girl from that frozen pond, I find that I do not regret stopping the ceremony to speak with you. A knock at the door interrupted them before Elena could respond. Lord Reginald entered without waiting for permission, his expression tight with barely controlled frustration, his eyes flicking between the Duke and Elena with obvious suspicion. Your Grace, he said stiffly, the entire court is waiting. The officiant does not know how to proceed. Nobles from 3 neighboring territories have traveled for days to witness this ceremony, and they are beginning to ask questions I cannot answer. The Duke's expression shifted back into the composed, unreadable mask Elena had first seen him wearing on the platform, though something in his eyes remained different now, warmer than before. Tell them the ceremony will resume within the hour, he said. I simply needed a moment to attend to an important matter. Lord Reginald's gaze settled on Elena, and though his expression remained carefully neutral, Elena could feel the weight of his disapproval pressing against her like a physical thing. Might I ask your Grace, what matter could possibly be more important than your own investiture? You may ask, the Duke said evenly, but I do not owe you an answer this moment, Reginald. Please see that the court is settled and prepared to resume shortly. Lord Reginald's jaw tightened, but he offered a stiff bow and left the room without another word, though the look he cast toward Elena on his way out made it clear he intended to have more questions for her later, questions she suspected she would not enjoy answering. Once the door closed again, the Duke turned back to Elena, and for a moment, the composed mask slipped once more, revealing the same searching, uncertain expression from before. I must return to the courtyard, he said. I cannot delay any longer without causing serious concern among the nobles gathered there. But I would like to speak with you again, properly, once the ceremony has concluded. Will you allow me that?" Elena hesitated. Every instinct told her that the wise thing to do would be to slip quietly out of the palace the moment she had the chance, to return to her mother's small home and her ordinary life of mending hems and stitching buttons, to forget this strange and impossible morning had ever happened. Nobles did not seek out seamstresses' daughters for meaningful conversation. Whatever connection the Duke believed existed between them, surely it would fade the moment he returned to his duties and remembered exactly who and what she was. But there was something in his voice, some quiet sincerity, that made it impossible for her to simply refuse him. "I will stay," she said finally. Something eased in the Duke's shoulders, a tension she had not realized he was carrying, until it began to release. "Thank you," he said softly. Then, after a brief pause, he added, "Edmund will see that you are comfortable while you wait. And Elena, I am sorry for the disruption this has caused you. I know none of this is what you expected when you came here today." "No," Elena admitted, a small, uncertain smile tugging at her lips despite everything. "It certainly was not." The Duke left the room, and Elena stood alone once more, staring out the same window he had gazed through moments before, watching the courtyard below slowly return to order. Chairs realigned, banners straightened, nobles settling back into their seats with expressions still marked by confusion and curiosity. Somewhere out there, hundreds of people were waiting to see the ceremony they had traveled so far to witness, unaware that the girl responsible for the delay was standing just above them, her heart still racing, her mind still struggling to make sense of a morning that had turned her entire world upside down in the span of a single glance. She thought of her mother, likely still bent over her sewing table at this very hour, unaware that her daughter had wandered into the middle of the most talked-about scandal Ashbourne had seen in years. She thought of the pond from her childhood, a memory she had not revisited in over a decade, now suddenly vivid and sharp in her mind. The cold water, the frightened boy, the desperate scramble to pull him to safety, before either of them slipped beneath the ice completely. Had that boy truly grown into the man who now stood before crowds of nobles, commanding the kind of respect and quiet authority that came only with great power? It seemed impossible, and yet nothing about this day had followed the rules of what seemed possible. Edmund knocked softly at the door a few minutes later, offering to bring her tea while she waited, his manner far gentler now than it had been in the courtyard. Elena accepted gratefully, glad for anything that might steady her trembling hands, and settled back into the velvet chair to wait, uncertain what the rest of the day might bring, but certain of one thing at least. Whatever happened next, her life would never quite return to what it had been before she slipped through that service gate this morning. Outside, the trumpets sounded once more, signaling that the ceremony was finally about to resume, and somewhere among the crowd of curious nobles, whispers continued to spread about the mysterious girl, who had, for reasons no one yet understood, managed to stop a duke's investiture in its tracks. The ceremony resumed exactly as the Duke had promised, though the atmosphere in the courtyard had changed completely, where before the nobles had sat with polite, practiced expressions, waiting to witness a formality they had seen performed many times over the generations. Now every face was alive with curiosity, every whisper carrying speculation about the girl who had been led away toward the palace. The officiant, still visibly shaken by the unprecedented pause, cleared his throat twice before finding his voice again and guiding the Duke through the remainder of the oath. Elena watched none of this. She remained in the receiving room, seated by the window with a cup of tea, slowly cooling in her hands, listening to the distant rise and fall of the officiant's voice, carried faintly on the breeze. She could not make out the words from this distance, but she recognized the rhythm of formal speech, the pauses meant for solemn reflection, and finally, after what felt like an eternity, the sound of trumpets and cheering that told her the ceremony had reached its conclusion. Duke Alistair Whitmore was now, officially and completely, the confirmed ruler of Ashbourne. Elena set down her teacup and stood, smoothing the front of her plain brown dress, with hands that had finally stopped trembling, though her heart still beat with a strange, unfamiliar urgency. She did not know what would happen next. Perhaps the Duke, now that his official duties were complete, would return to the receiving room, only to explain, gently but firmly, that whatever connection he believed existed between them had been a mistake, a trick of memory brought on by the stress of the day. Perhaps she would be given a small token of thanks for her patience, and quietly escorted back through the service gate she had entered through that morning, never to set foot inside the palace again. But that was not what happened. The door opened, and instead of the Duke, Lord Reginald entered the room, his expression carefully composed but his eyes sharp with calculation. He studied Elena for a long moment before speaking, and when he finally did, his voice carried the polished courtesy of a man well practiced in diplomatic conversation, though something colder lurked beneath the surface. "Miss Marsh," he said, using her name with a precision that told her he had already learned a great deal about her in the short time since the ceremony began. "I trust you have been comfortable." "Yes, my lord," Elena said carefully, sensing that this conversation, unlike the one she had shared with the Duke, would require far greater caution. "The Duke has asked me to extend an invitation," Lord Reginald continued, his tone giving nothing away. "He wishes for you to remain at the palace as his guest, at least for the coming days, while certain matters are discussed and clarified." Elena's stomach tightened. "Matters, my lord?" "The Duke believes there may be a connection between your family and his own, dating back many years," Lord Reginald said, choosing his words with obvious care. "He wishes to explore this connection properly, without the pressures of public attention. I must be honest with you, Miss Marsh. I do not entirely share his enthusiasm for this pursuit, but I serve at his pleasure, and it is not my place to refuse his wishes on your behalf." Elena studied the advisor's face, searching for some clue as to what he truly thought of her sudden and unexpected arrival into palace life. She found only careful neutrality, though something in the set of his shoulders suggested a tension he was working hard to conceal. "I do not wish to cause any trouble," Elena said honestly. "If my presence here creates difficulty for the Duke, I would rather return home." For the briefest moment, something like approval flickered across Lord Reginald's face, though it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. "That is a wise sentiment, Miss Marsh, and I appreciate your candor. However, the Duke has made his wishes clear, and I would advise against refusing him directly. He is not a man accustomed to having his requests denied, though I suspect you have already gathered as much from this morning's events." Before Elena could respond, the door opened again, and this time, it was the Duke himself who entered, still dressed in the formal attire of his newly confirmed title, though the golden sash across his chest seemed to sit uneasily on his shoulders, as though the weight of it was something he had not yet grown accustomed to carrying. "Reginald," the Duke said, his tone polite but carrying an unmistakable note of dismissal. "Thank you for keeping Miss Marsh company. I will take it from here." Lord Reginald bowed stiffly and left the room, though not before casting one final, unreadable glance toward Elena, a look that seemed to carry both warning and reluctant curiosity in equal measure. Once they were alone, the Duke's formal posture eased slightly, and he gestured toward the chair Elena had recently vacated. "Please, sit. You must be exhausted after everything that has happened today." Elena sat, though she remained perched on the edge of the chair, still unable to fully relax in surroundings so far removed from anything she had ever known. "Your Grace," she began carefully, "Lord Reginald mentioned that you wish for me to remain here as your guest. I must be honest with you, I do not know if that is wise." The Duke pulled a second chair close and sat facing her, close enough that she could see the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes, evidence of a man who had carried far more weight on his shoulders than his calm exterior usually revealed. "Why do you say that?" "Because I do not belong here," Elena said simply. "I am a seamstress's daughter. My family has no titles, no wealth beyond what my mother earns through her needlework. Whatever connection you believe exists between us, however strong the memory feels to you, I fear it will only create difficulty for both of us." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, considering her words carefully before he spoke again. "You are right that it will create difficulty," he admitted. "I saw the way Reginald looked at you just now. I imagine the reaction among the wider court will be far less measured than his, but I find that I do not care as much about that difficulty as perhaps I should." "Why not?" Elena asked, genuinely curious despite herself. The Duke's gaze drifted toward the window, toward the courtyard, where the last of the ceremonial decorations were being carefully taken down by palace staff. "Because for as long as I can remember, my life has been arranged around expectations that were never truly mine," he said quietly. "The title I hold now was decided for me, before I was even born. The woman I am expected to marry was chosen for political convenience, not for any bond of genuine affection between us. Every decision of consequence in my life has been made with the interests of the region in mind, rarely my own. Elena listened, struck by the quiet honesty in his voice, so different from the composed, distant figure she had first glimpsed on the ceremonial platform. When I saw your face today, the Duke continued, for the first time in longer than I can remember, something happened that was not arranged, not expected, not planned by anyone but fate itself. I do not know if you are truly the girl from that frozen pond. Perhaps I am simply a man desperate for something real, in a life built entirely on obligation, but I would like the chance to find out, if you are willing to give it to me. Elena's chest tightened with an emotion she could not quite name, something caught between fear and a fragile, unfamiliar hope. She thought of her mother, waiting for her at home, of the ordinary life she had always assumed would be hers, mending hems and stitching buttons until she grew old and gray, never knowing anything beyond the narrow streets of the neighborhood where she had been born. About a Duke spending his time with a girl like me? They will say many things, the Duke admitted. Most of them unkind, I imagine, at least at first. But I have spent my entire life listening to what people expect me to do, Elena. And today, for the first time, I acted on something I felt, rather than something I was told to feel. I do not intend to abandon that simply because it makes others uncomfortable. A knock interrupted them, softer this time, and a young servant girl entered carrying a folded note on a small silver tray, her eyes wide with poorly hidden curiosity, as she glanced between the Duke and Elena, before hurrying back out of the room. The Duke unfolded the note, and Elena watched his expression shift as he read it, a flicker of tension crossing his features, before he carefully smoothed it away. What is it? Elena asked. Lady Constance has arrived early, the Duke said, folding the note again with deliberate care. She was not expected until next week. Elena felt a strange, unexpected pang at the name, though she could not have explained why a stranger's arrival should matter to her at all. Who is Lady Constance? The Duke's expression grew carefully neutral, the same practiced composure Elena had first seen him wear on the ceremonial platform. She is the noblewoman my family has long intended for me to marry, he said, an arrangement made years ago, before either of us had any say in the matter. Elena's stomach twisted uncomfortably. Then perhaps I truly should return home, Your Grace. It would not be right for me to remain here, complicating matters that are none of my concern. They are very much your concern now, the Duke said quietly, though his tone carried no anger, only a kind of resigned honesty. Whether either of us wished for it or not, the events of this morning have already changed everything. Lady Constance's arrival simply means those changes will need to be addressed sooner than I had hoped. Elena did not know how to respond. She sat in silence, watching the Duke's face carefully, searching for some sign of what he truly wanted, some indication of whether she was a welcome disruption to his carefully arranged life, or an unwelcome complication he would soon regret entangling himself with. I will not force you to stay, the Duke said finally, rising from his chair and moving toward the window once more. If you wish to return home tonight, I will see that you are escorted safely, and that no harm comes to you or your family because of what happened today. But I am asking you, honestly and without any expectation, to consider staying, even if only for a short while, so that we might understand what this connection between us truly means. Elena looked down at her hands, calloused from years of needlework, so different from the soft, uncalloused hands of the noblewomen she imagined filled the Duke's world. She thought of the frozen pond from her childhood, of the desperate scramble to save a boy she had never known, of the strange and impossible way that single moment from so long ago had somehow led her here, to this room, facing a choice that would shape the rest of her life. I will stay, she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. For a little while at least. The Duke turned back to face her, and for the first time since she had met him, a genuine smile broke across his features, brief but unmistakably real. Thank you, Elena, he said softly. Whatever comes next, I am glad you are here. Outside the window, the palace grounds buzzed with quiet activity, as servants prepared for the unexpected arrival of Lady Constance, unaware that within the walls of the receiving room, a decision had just been made that would soon send ripples of scandal and speculation through every corner of the court, ripples that neither Elena nor the Duke could yet fully understand the consequences of. Word of the morning's events spread through the palace faster than any servant could carry a message by hand. By the time the sun had begun its slow descent toward late afternoon, every corner of Ashbourne's court, from the kitchens to the grandest chambers, buzzed with whispered speculation about the seamstress's daughter who had somehow captured the attention of their newly confirmed duke. Some claimed she was a long-lost relative of a noble family, secretly restored to her rightful place. Others whispered darker theories, suggesting she had used some manner of trickery to enchant a man known throughout the region for his steady, unshakable composure. Elena heard none of these rumors directly, though she could sense their presence in the sideways glances of servants who passed her in the hallway, in the way conversations seemed to pause and then resume in hushed tones whenever she walked by. She had been given a small guest chamber near the eastern wing of the palace, modest by the standards of the nobility, but grander than anything she had ever slept in before, with a bed twice the size of her own, and windows overlooking a garden bursting with flowers she could not begin to name. She sat by that window now, watching the sun paint the garden in shades of gold and orange, when a soft knock at her door drew her attention. She opened it to find a young woman about her own age, dressed simply but neatly, holding a folded gown draped carefully over one arm. "Miss Marsh," the young woman said with a small, hesitant curtsy. "My name is Prudence. I have been asked to attend to you during your stay. The Duke thought you might like a change of clothes before dinner this evening." Elena glanced down at her own dress, still faintly dusty from crouching behind the hedge that morning, and felt a fresh wave of self-consciousness wash over her. "Thank you, Prudence. That is very kind." As Prudence helped her into the borrowed gown, a soft blue fabric far finer than anything Elena had ever worn, the young woman chatted quietly, clearly eager for conversation, despite her nervousness. "The whole palace is talking about you, you know," she admitted, carefully fastening a row of small buttons along Elena's back. "Some of the older servants say they have never seen the Duke behave so unexpectedly. Not once, not in all the years he has lived here." "I did not mean to cause such a disturbance," Elena said quietly. "Oh, I do not think anyone truly minds," Prudence said with a small smile. "Well, perhaps Lord Reginald minds, but most of us simply find it rather exciting. The Duke has always seemed so serious, so burdened. It is nice to see something surprise him for once." Elena appreciated the kindness in Prudence's words, though she could not fully shake the anxious knot that had settled in her stomach since Lord Reginald's mention of Lady Constance earlier that day. As if summoned by the very thought, a sudden commotion echoed from somewhere near the main entrance of the palace, the sound of raised voices and hurried footsteps carrying faintly through the corridors. "That will be Lady Constance," Prudence said, glancing toward the door with poorly concealed curiosity. "She arrived not long ago, a full week earlier than expected. I heard she was quite displeased to learn the ceremony had been delayed." Elena's chest tightened at the mention of the noblewoman's name, though she tried her best to keep her expression neutral. "Is she very grand?" Prudence considered the question carefully. "She is very beautiful, and very proud, from what I have heard. Her family holds significant lands to the north, and the match between her and the Duke was arranged long ago to strengthen ties between the two territories. I do not know her personally, but the servants who have traveled with her say she does not take kindly to surprises." Dinner that evening was a tense, uncomfortable affair. Elena had been invited to join a smaller gathering in one of the palace's private dining rooms, rather than the grand hall where the wider court typically gathered, a decision she suspected the Duke had made deliberately, to shield her from the harshest scrutiny of the assembled nobility. Even so, the atmosphere in the room crackled with unspoken tension the moment Lady Constance swept through the doorway. She was, as Prudence had described, undeniably beautiful, with pale golden hair swept elegantly atop her head, and a gown of deep emerald silk that seemed to catch and hold the candlelight with every movement. Her eyes, sharp and assessing, swept across the room and settled on Elena almost immediately, lingering there with an intensity that made Elena's skin prickle with discomfort. "So," Lady Constance said, her voice smooth and cultured, carrying just enough edge to make the single word feel like a challenge. "This is the girl who delayed my future husband's investiture." "Constance," the Duke said, his tone carrying a note of gentle warning. "Elena is my guest, and I would ask that you extend her the same courtesy you would show any other guest at my table." Lady Constance's lips curved into a thin, polished smile that did not reach her eyes. "Of course, Your Grace. I meant no disrespect." She turned her attention back to Elena, studying her with the kind of careful, calculating gaze that made Elena feel as though she were being measured against some invisible standard she could never hope to meet. "Tell me, Miss Marsh, what exactly is your family's standing? I do not believe I recognize the name." "My mother is a seamstress," Elena said, keeping her voice steady, despite the heat rising in her cheeks. "We have no title, my lady. I imagine you would not recognize our name." Something flickered across Lady Constance's face, though whether it was surprise at Elena's honesty or quiet satisfaction at having her suspicions confirmed, Elena could not tell. "How refreshing," Lady Constance said smoothly. Honesty is such a rare quality among the court these days. The dinner continued in much the same fashion, Lady Constance's polished conversation carrying an undercurrent of pointed questions and subtle jabs that Elena did her best to navigate without losing her composure entirely. The Duke, for his part, remained largely quiet, his jaw tight with barely restrained frustration each time Lady Constance's comments veered too close to open insult, though he said little to directly intervene, as though unsure how to defend Elena without further inflaming a situation already balanced on the edge of open conflict. Lord Reginald, seated near the head of the table, watched the entire exchange with the careful, unreadable expression of a man calculating every possible outcome, occasionally interjecting with smooth diplomatic phrases whenever the tension threatened to boil over into something impossible to ignore. It was only after the final course had been cleared away, and the small gathering began to disperse toward their respective chambers for the evening, that Lady Constance found a moment alone with Elena in the corridor outside the dining room, the Duke having been pulled aside by Lord Reginald to discuss some urgent matter of court business. "A word, Miss Marsh," Lady Constance said, her polished smile vanishing the moment they were out of earshot of the others, replaced by something colder and far more direct. Elena stopped, forcing herself to meet the noblewoman's gaze, despite the anxious flutter in her chest.
"Yes, my lady?"
"I do not know what game you believe you are playing," Lady Constance said, her voice low and controlled, "but I would advise you to consider your position carefully. Whatever fanciful notion Alistair has convinced himself of, whatever childhood memory he believes connects the two of you, it changes nothing. Our families have been bound by agreement for years. This region depends on the stability that our marriage will secure. I do not intend to allow a seamstress's daughter to unravel years of careful planning because of a foolish sentiment born from a single strange morning." "I never asked for any of this," Elena said quietly, refusing to let her voice waver, despite the pressure building in her chest. "I did not come here seeking a place at the Duke's side, my lady. I only wished to watch the ceremony." "And yet here you are," Lady Constance said, her eyes narrowing slightly, seated at his private table, dressed in borrowed silk, occupying a guest chamber in his palace. "Intentions matter little, once circumstances have already changed, Miss Marsh. I would think carefully about how long you intend to remain here, for both our sakes." Before Elena could formulate a response, Lady Constance swept past her down the corridor, her emerald gown trailing behind her like a warning, leaving Elena standing alone in the flickering candlelight, her heart pounding with a mixture of anger and uncertainty she had not expected to feel so strongly. She made her way back to her guest chamber in a daze, Lady Constance's words echoing in her mind long after the noblewoman had disappeared from sight. Perhaps Lady Constance was right. Perhaps Elena's presence here truly was nothing more than a complication, a temporary distraction the Duke would eventually set aside, once the weight of duty and obligation reasserted itself, as it inevitably would. She sat by her window long into the evening, watching the last lights of the palace flicker out one by one across the darkened grounds, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake in agreeing to stay, wondering if tomorrow would bring the courage to finally return home where she belonged, far away from silk gowns and calculating noblewomen, and a Duke whose gentle attention had already begun to feel far more dangerous than any frozen pond from her distant childhood memories. Elena did not sleep well that night. She woke before dawn, her mind still turning over Lady Constance's cold warning, and found herself dressed and standing by the window long before the first servants began stirring in the corridors outside her chamber. The garden below sat quiet and still in the pale early light, mist curling low across the grass, and for a long while, Elena simply watched it, trying to decide what she truly wanted from a day that had not yet begun. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She opened the door expecting Prudence, but instead found the Duke himself standing in the corridor, still dressed simply, his dark hair slightly tousled, as though he too had slept poorly. "I hope it is not too early to call on you," he said, a note of uncertainty in his voice that seemed strange coming from a man who commanded an entire region. "I could not sleep, and I found myself wanting to speak with you before the day's obligations took hold of me again." "Don't." Elena stepped aside to let him in, though she remained near the door, unsure how to begin the conversation she knew needed to happen. "Your Grace, I must tell you something about last night." She recounted, as carefully and honestly as she could, the exchange with Lady Constance in the corridor, watching the Duke's expression darken with each word. By the time she finished, his jaw had tightened into a hard line, and he paced a slow circle near the window before finally speaking. "I am sorry," he said. "I should have anticipated that Constance would seek you out. I will speak with her." "Perhaps she is right," Elena said quietly, voicing the doubt that had kept her awake through most of the night. "Perhaps I truly do not belong here, Your Grace. Your region depends on stability. A marriage arranged for years cannot simply be set aside because of a girl who wandered in uninvited." The Duke turned to face her fully, and something in his expression, a quiet, determined resolve, made Elena's breath catch in her throat. "Elena, I have spent my entire life doing what was expected of me, marrying whom I was told to marry, ruling as I was taught to rule, speaking only the words others prepared for me to speak. I am not asking you to solve every difficulty this region faces. I am only asking for the chance to know you properly, without the weight of arrangements neither of us chose bearing down on every conversation we share." "But the marriage," Elena pressed. Lady Constance spoke of it as though it were already settled, as though nothing could change it now. "Nothing is truly settled until vows are spoken," the Duke said carefully. "I have resisted this particular arrangement for longer than anyone in the court realizes. Elena, I simply never had a reason strong enough to voice that resistance openly, not until yesterday." Elena studied his face, searching for any trace of doubt or hesitation, but found only quiet sincerity. Still, a nagging uncertainty remained, one she could not fully shake. "Your Grace, may I ask you something honestly?" "Always." "Is it truly me you see?" she asked slowly. "Or is it only the memory of a girl from a frozen pond, a memory you have carried for so long it has become more comforting than real? I do not wish to be a symbol of something from your childhood. I wish to be known as myself, whoever that turns out to be." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, considering her question, with the same careful weight he seemed to give every important decision. "That is a fair question," he said finally, "and one I have asked myself as well, through most of last night. I believe, at first, it was the memory that caught my attention. But Elena, I have spoken with you now on 3 separate occasions, and each time, it is not the memory of a girl I barely knew that keeps drawing me back. It is you. Your honesty. The way you speak plainly, even when it would be easier to flatter me the way everyone else in this palace does. That is not something a childhood memory could ever manufacture." Something warm unfurled in Elena's chest at his words, though she quickly reminded herself of the vast difference in their circumstances, of Lady Constance's cold warning, of the whispers that had already begun spreading through every corner of the palace. "Even if that is true," she said carefully, "it does not change the difficulties we face. Your advisors, the court, an entire region, depending on the stability your marriage was meant to secure. These are not small matters, Your Grace." "No," the Duke agreed, "they are not, but I would rather face them honestly than continue pretending a life built entirely on obligation is one I am content to live, simply because it is easier than the alternative." A soft knock interrupted them once more, and Prudence entered with an apologetic bow, informing the Duke that Lord Reginald had requested his presence urgently in the council chamber, something about matters that could not wait until later in the morning. The Duke's expression tightened with obvious reluctance, but he nodded and turned to leave, pausing at the door to look back at Elena one final time. "Will you walk with me in the garden this afternoon?" he asked. "Once my morning obligations are finished, I would like to continue this conversation properly, away from prying ears and hurried interruptions." "I would like that," Elena said, and found that she meant it, despite every reasonable doubt still swirling in her mind. The Duke left, and Elena spent the remainder of the morning in her guest chamber, trying to occupy herself with idle tasks, though her thoughts kept drifting back to the conversation they had shared. Around midday, Prudence arrived with a simple meal and news that quickly banished any lingering calm Elena had managed to gather. "There is quite a commotion in the council chamber," Prudence said, setting down the tray with visibly nervous hands. "Lord Reginald and Lady Constance have been meeting privately all morning. The other servants say they have overheard raised voices more than once." Elena's stomach tightened with unease. "Do you know what they are discussing?" Prudence hesitated, glancing toward the door as though worried someone might overhear even now. "I should not gossip, Miss Marsh, but I did hear one of the kitchen maids mention something about your family. Lord Reginald sent a rider out early this morning toward the Eastern District, the same district where you and your mother live, I believe." A cold, uneasy feeling settled over Elena at these words. She thought of her mother, alone in their small home, unaware of the strange and complicated circumstances her daughter had become entangled in. What could Lord Reginald possibly want from her family, so far from the palace and its politics? She did not have to wait long to find out. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, and the promised garden walk with the Duke drew closer, a servant arrived at her door with an urgent summons, not from the Duke, but from Lord Reginald himself, requesting her presence in a small private study near the western wing of the palace. Elena followed the servant through unfamiliar corridors, her heart pounding with a growing sense of dread, uncertain what she would find waiting for her, but sensing, with every step, that whatever Lord Reginald had discovered during his morning of urgent inquiries was about to change the course of her stay at the palace, in ways she could not yet begin to predict. The study door stood slightly ajar when she arrived, and through the gap, she could hear Lord Reginald's low, measured voice speaking to someone she could not see, his tone carrying a weight of careful calculation that made the unease in her stomach twist tighter with every passing second. "Come in, Miss Marsh," Lord Reginald called out, before she had even raised her hand to knock, as though he had sensed her presence in the corridor the moment she arrived. "I believe we have a great deal to discuss." Elena pushed open the door, steeling herself for whatever conversation awaited her inside, unaware that the answers Lord Reginald had uncovered that morning would soon unravel secrets about her own family that even she had never known existed. The study was small and dimly lit, its walls lined with tall shelves of leather-bound books and rolled documents that spoke of years spent managing the affairs of an entire region. Lord Reginald sat behind a wide desk, his hands folded neatly in front of him, and across from him, seated stiffly in a high-backed chair, was a woman Elena did not recognize, though something about her weathered face and careful, watchful eyes felt oddly familiar. "Please, sit," Lord Reginald said, gesturing toward an empty chair near the desk. "This is Mrs. Alden. She served in this palace many years ago, during the reign of the Duke's father." Elena sat cautiously, glancing between the two of them, uncertain what any of this had to do with her. "I do not understand, my lord. Why have you called me here?" Lord Reginald leaned back slightly in his chair, studying her with the same careful, assessing gaze he had worn since their first meeting. "I confess, Miss Marsh, that when the Duke first insisted on bringing you into this palace, I was skeptical of his intentions, and frankly, somewhat concerned. A man in his position cannot simply act on childhood sentiment, however genuine it may feel to him, so I made some inquiries of my own." "About my family," Elena said, her voice tighter than she intended. "Precisely," Lord Reginald confirmed. "I sent word to the Eastern District this morning, hoping to learn more about your background, your mother's history, anything that might explain the Duke's sudden and rather extraordinary fixation on you. What I found was rather more than I expected." Mrs. Alden shifted in her seat, her weathered hands gripping the arms of the chair as she studied Elena with an intensity that made the younger woman distinctly uncomfortable. "You have your mother's eyes," Mrs. Alden said quietly, almost to herself. Elena's breath caught. "You knew my mother?" "I did," Mrs. Alden said. "Many years ago, before you were born, your mother served in this very palace, as a seamstress to the household of the Duke's father, the old Duke Harrington Whitmore." Elena stared at the older woman, certain she had misheard. "That cannot be right. My mother has always worked from our home in the Eastern District. She has never spoken of serving in the palace." "She would not have," Mrs. Alden said, her voice growing quieter, heavier, with some old and painful memory. She left under difficult circumstances, Miss Marsh. Circumstances that were not entirely fair to her, if I may say so honestly. Lord Reginald leaned forward, his earlier suspicion now tempered with something closer to genuine curiosity. Mrs. Alden has explained to me that your mother was dismissed from her position nearly 2 decades ago, following an incident involving the old Duke. The details remain somewhat unclear, even to those of us who served here at the time, but the dismissal was sudden, and by most accounts, unjust. What kind of incident? Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper, though her mind raced through 100 half-formed possibilities, each one more troubling than the last. Mrs. Alden hesitated, glancing toward Lord Reginald as though seeking permission to continue. He gave a small, encouraging nod, and she pressed on. Your mother was young when she came to serve here, barely older than you are now. She was skilled with a needle, talented enough that she quickly became a favorite among the ladies of the court. The old Duke took notice of her as well, though not in the way one might assume. He respected her work, valued her opinion on matters of the household, in a way that made certain other members of the staff quite jealous of her position. Jealous enough to cause trouble, Lord Reginald added grimly. The burrito was cold. There were accusations, Mrs. Alden continued. False ones, I always believed, suggesting that your mother had taken items from the household that did not belong to her. Small pieces of jewelry that went missing around the same time she was dismissed. She protested her innocence, but the old Duke, under pressure from certain advisors eager to see her gone, chose not to investigate the matter fully. She was sent away without references, without any chance to defend herself properly, and as far as I know, she never returned to the palace again. Elena sat in stunned silence, trying to reconcile this story with the mother she had known her entire life, a woman who worked tirelessly and honestly, who had raised her alone with quiet dignity, despite circumstances that had always seemed, to Elena, simply the natural order of things. She had never questioned why her mother's skills seemed so far beyond what their modest circumstances suggested, why she sometimes spoke with a polish and refinement that seemed at odds with their humble neighborhood. Now, suddenly, pieces of a puzzle Elena had never known existed began to click into place. Why would she never tell me this? Elena asked quietly. Shame, perhaps, Mrs. Alden said gently, or simply the desire to protect you from a painful chapter of her past. Losing one's position and reputation so suddenly, so unjustly, that is not an easy thing to speak of, especially to a child who deserved a simpler, happier story of her family's history. Lord Reginald cleared his throat, drawing both women's attention back to him. There is more, Miss Marsh, and I believe this is the part that will interest you most directly. The old Duke, in the years before his passing, expressed regret to several members of his household regarding the manner of your mother's dismissal. He never publicly corrected the injustice, but Mrs. Alden tells me he made private inquiries about your mother's welfare more than once in the years that followed, inquiries that never reached her, as far as we know. Why does this matter now? Elena asked, though even as she spoke the words, some part of her already understood the shape of the answer. Because it explains a great deal, Lord Reginald said, his earlier coldness toward her softened by something that almost resembled sympathy. The Duke, our current Duke, would have been a young boy during the years your mother served here. It is entirely possible, likely even, that their paths crossed during that time, in ways neither of them would have fully understood or remembered clearly. Perhaps your family's connection to this palace runs deeper than any of us realized, deeper even than a chance encounter at a frozen pond. Elena's mind reeled at the implications. If her mother had served in this very palace, if the old Duke himself had shown her some measure of favor before circumstances turned against her, then perhaps the strange, fated pull between Elena and the current Duke was not so strange after all. Perhaps it was the echo of a connection that had begun long before either of them were born, woven through two families in ways neither had ever suspected. Does the Duke know any of this? Elena asked. Not yet, Lord Reginald said. I wish to speak with you first, to understand what you knew, and to gauge your reaction before bringing this information to him directly. I confess, Miss Marsh, my initial suspicions about your intentions were rooted in caution for the Duke's position, not malice toward you personally. Learning this history has given me a great deal to reconsider. Mrs. Alden reached across the small space between their chairs and gently took Elena's hand. her weathered fingers surprisingly warm and steady. "Your mother was a good woman, Miss Marsh. Whatever happened to her here, whatever injustice she suffered, she did not deserve it. I am glad to see her daughter has found her way back to this palace, even if the path here was rather more unusual than most." Elena felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, though she blinked them back, unwilling to let her emotions overwhelm her in front of Lord Reginald, whose opinion of her, she suspected, still hung delicately in the balance, despite the sympathy he now seemed to be extending. "Thank you for telling me this," she said finally. "I need to speak with my mother. She deserves to know that the truth is finally coming to light, after all these years." "Of course," Lord Reginald said, rising from his chair. "I will arrange for a carriage to take you to the Eastern District this evening, if you wish it. And Miss Marsh, I believe it would be wise for the Duke to accompany you, given everything we have just discussed." Elena nodded, her thoughts still spinning with the weight of everything she had just learned. As she rose to leave the study, Mrs. Alden caught her arm gently one final time. "There is one more thing you should know," the older woman said, her voice dropping lower, almost conspiratorial. "Before your mother was dismissed, she was, for a brief time, quite close with the old Duke's wife, the current Duke's mother. I do not know all the details, as I was young myself at the time, but I remember whispers that the friendship between them caused a great deal of tension within the household, tension that may have played some part in the accusations that followed. If you truly wish to understand your family's connection to this palace, that friendship may hold answers even I do not have." Elena left the study with her mind racing, the comfortable certainty of her ordinary life dissolving further with every new revelation, replaced by a tangled web of old secrets and buried injustices that seemed to stretch back far further than she had ever imagined. Secrets that now, quite unexpectedly, had become her own to untangle. The Duke found her a short while later, standing alone in the palace garden where they had planned to walk together that afternoon, though the peaceful conversation he had likely imagined was now the furthest thing from either of their minds. Elena told him everything, the words tumbling out faster than she intended, about Mrs. Alden, about her mother's years of quiet service within these very walls, about the accusations that had ended it all so abruptly and so unfairly. The Duke listened in silence, his expression shifting from surprise to something far more troubled as the story unfolded. When she finished, he sat down heavily on a nearby stone bench, running a hand through his dark hair, as though trying to physically absorb the weight of what he had just learned. "I never knew," he said quietly. "I was so young when all of this happened. I have vague memories of servants coming and going, of my mother having friends among the household staff, but nothing specific enough to recall your mother by name or face." "Mrs. Alden said your mother and mine were close," Elena said, settling onto the bench beside him. "She believes that friendship may have caused the tension that led to my mother's dismissal." The Duke's jaw tightened. "My mother passed when I was quite young, Elena. I have very few memories of her, and even fewer of the details surrounding the years before her passing. If there is truth to what Mrs. Alden suggests, if my own father allowed an injustice to occur that hurt someone my mother cared for, then I owe your family a debt I never knew existed until this very moment." "You owe us nothing," Elena said gently. "None of this was your doing." "Perhaps not directly," the Duke said, "but I hold the title now. I carry the responsibility for correcting the mistakes of those who came before me, whether or not I was the one who made them. Will you allow me to accompany you to speak with your mother? I would like to hear her account directly, and to offer whatever apology and restitution I am able to give." Elena hesitated only briefly before nodding. "She will be surprised to see a Duke arrive at our door." "Then perhaps it is time she was pleasantly surprised, for once," he said, a faint, determined smile touching his lips, despite the weight of the conversation. The carriage ride to the Eastern District that evening felt like crossing between two entirely different worlds. Elena watched the grand towers and manicured gardens of the palace grounds give way slowly to the narrower, more crowded streets of the neighborhood she had grown up in, streets lined with modest homes, and the familiar sounds of evening life, children calling to one another, the distant clatter of a blacksmith finishing his day's work, the warm smell of bread baking somewhere nearby. Her mother, Margaret Marsh, was bent over her sewing table, exactly as Elena had imagined, a lamp burning low beside her as she worked careful stitches into a length of fine fabric. When the knock came at the door, she rose with the tired patience of a woman accustomed to unexpected requests from neighbors needing urgent mending, and the sight that greeted her when she opened it, her daughter standing beside a man dressed in clothes far too fine for their humble street, left her frozen in stunned silence for several long seconds. "Elena," she finally managed, her eyes darting nervously to the Duke beside her daughter. "What is the meaning of this?" "Mother," Elena said gently, "may we come in? There is a great deal I need to tell you, and someone I think you may remember, even if it has been many years." Margaret Marsh's hands trembled slightly as she stepped aside to let them enter, her small, tidy home suddenly feeling impossibly crowded with the weight of the Duke's presence. She offered them seats at her modest table, her movements stiff with poorly concealed anxiety, and it was only when the Duke finally spoke, introducing himself formally and explaining, as gently as he could, the reason for their visit, that her carefully composed expression finally cracked. "You know about the palace," Margaret whispered, her eyes filling with tears she seemed to be fighting hard to contain. "About what happened to me there." "I only learned of it this afternoon," the Duke said, his voice carrying a sincerity that seemed to ease some of the older woman's visible tension. "Mrs. Alden told us of the accusations that led to your dismissal, and of the friendship you shared with my mother. I am sorry, deeply sorry, for whatever injustice was done to you under my father's household. It was wrong, and I intend to see it corrected." Margaret's tears finally spilled over, though her voice remained steady as she spoke. "I never stole anything," she said. "I want you to know that, Your Grace, whatever else you may have heard, I loved my work in that palace. I loved the friendship I shared with your mother. She was kind to me in a way few of the other nobility ever were, and when the accusations came, when I was dismissed without any chance to defend myself, it broke something in me that took years to mend." "I believe you," the Duke said simply, "and I intend to make certain the truth is known, formally and publicly, so that no shadow of doubt remains over your name." Margaret reached across the table and took Elena's hand, her grip trembling but firm. "I never wanted you to carry the weight of what happened to me," she said to her daughter. "That is why I never spoke of it. I wanted you to have a simple, happy life, free of the bitterness that took me so long to overcome." "I understand," Elena said softly, though her heart ached at the thought of her mother carrying such pain alone for so many years. "But I am glad to know the truth now, Mother. I am glad we can face it together." The Duke remained largely quiet through the rest of the conversation, listening carefully as Margaret shared more details of her time in the palace, of the small kindnesses his own mother had shown her, of the quiet grief that had settled over the household in the years following the old Duke's death. By the time the evening drew to a close, something had shifted in the room, a weight lifted that had rested there, unspoken, for nearly 2 decades. As they prepared to leave, the Duke turned to Margaret one final time. "I would like to offer you and Elena a place within the palace, if you are willing to accept it," he said, carefully. "Not out of obligation alone, though that is certainly part of it, but because I believe your family's connection to this region deserves to be honored properly, after everything that was taken from you." Margaret glanced at her daughter, searching her face for some indication of what she truly wanted, and Elena found herself nodding slowly, though uncertainty still lingered beneath her growing hope. "I would like that," Margaret said finally. "Though I confess, Your Grace, I never imagined my daughter's curiosity about a royal ceremony would lead us here." The Duke's expression softened into something warmer than Elena had yet seen from him, a genuine, unguarded happiness that seemed to erase some of the careful composure he had carried since the moment she first met him. "Neither did I," he admitted, "but I find that I am deeply grateful it did." As their carriage made its way back toward the palace, beneath a sky scattered with early stars, Elena found herself reflecting on how quickly her entire understanding of her own life had shifted, in the span of a single day, from a simple seamstress's daughter, with no connection to the grand world of nobility, to the daughter of a woman whose story was woven far more deeply into the history of Ashbourne than either of them had ever realized. But even as hope began to take root in her chest, a quiet unease remained. Lady Constance's cold warning still echoed in her memory, and Elena knew, with growing certainty, that the truth about her mother's past, however healing it might feel within the walls of their small home, would not be welcomed so warmly by everyone within the palace once it became known. Elena's suspicions proved correct sooner than she expected. Within 2 days, word of her mother's history within the palace had spread through the court, with the same speed as the original rumors about Elena herself, and the reaction among the nobility was far from the sympathetic understanding she had hoped for. Where once the whispers had painted her as a strange curiosity, a girl who had somehow caught the Duke's fleeting attention, now they carried a sharper, more dangerous edge, questioning whether the entire situation had been engineered from the start, whether Margaret Marsh had somehow orchestrated her daughter's presence at the ceremony as a means of finally correcting old grievances against the Whitmore family. Elena heard these rumors directly for the first time. During a small gathering the Duke had insisted she attend, a modest afternoon reception meant to introduce her properly to a handful of trusted nobles before any larger, more public acknowledgement of her place within his life. She stood near a tall window, sipping a cup of tea she had little appetite for, when she overheard two noblewomen speaking in hushed tones only a short distance away, clearly unaware or unconcerned that she might hear them. "It seems rather convenient," one of them murmured, "that the mother's old grievance should surface just as the daughter finds herself so suddenly favored by the Duke. One wonders if the girl was sent to that ceremony deliberately, knowing exactly what her presence might stir up." "A calculated play for sympathy and position," the other agreed. "Though I suppose one cannot entirely blame them, given how the old Duke treated the mother. Still, it does not sit well, does it? The whole affair feels rather too neatly arranged." Elena set down her teacup, her hands trembling slightly, and slipped away from the gathering before either woman could notice she had overheard them. She found the Duke a short while later in a quiet corridor, speaking with Lord Reginald in low, urgent tones, and the moment he saw her expression, he excused himself immediately to come to her side. "What is wrong?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. Elena repeated what she had overheard, watching his expression darken with each word. "They believe my mother orchestrated all of this," she said. "That we planned my presence at the ceremony deliberately, to force some kind of reconciliation or restitution from your family." "That is absurd," the Duke said firmly. "You had no way of knowing about your mother's history here. Neither of us did, until Lord Reginald's inquiry uncovered it." "I know that," Elena said, "but the court does not know it. Or perhaps they simply do not wish to believe it. It is easier for them to imagine a calculated scheme than to accept that something as simple as fate, or coincidence, could disrupt the careful order of their world." Lord Reginald, who had followed the Duke into the corridor, cleared his throat gently. "Your Grace, if I may, the rumors, however unfair, present a genuine difficulty. If left unaddressed, they will only grow more elaborate and more damaging with each retelling. I would advise a more public and direct response, sooner rather than later." Before the Duke could answer, the sound of brisk footsteps echoed from the far end of the corridor, and Lady Constance appeared, her expression carrying none of the polished courtesy she had worn during their first dinner together. Instead, her eyes blazed with barely restrained anger as she approached the small group. "I have just heard the most extraordinary rumor," she said, her voice tight and controlled, despite the fury evident beneath it. "That Margaret Marsh, dismissed from this palace, under a cloud of theft and scandal nearly 20 years ago, has now returned, through her daughter, to reclaim some manner of position within these walls. Is this true, Alistair?" "The dismissal was unjust," the Duke said evenly. "Margaret Marsh was innocent of the accusations brought against her. I intend to see her name properly cleared." "And in doing so," Lady Constance pressed, "you intend to elevate her daughter alongside her, a girl with no title, no wealth, no standing whatsoever, into a position at your side that rightfully belongs to me. Do you understand what this will do to the alliance our families have spent years building? Do you understand what it will do to this region's stability, should our neighboring territories believe you have abandoned a carefully negotiated agreement for the sake of a passing infatuation?" "It is not a passing infatuation," the Duke said, his voice hardening. "And I would ask you to speak of Elena with greater respect, Constance. She has done nothing to deserve the treatment she has received since arriving here." Lady Constance's eyes flashed dangerously, and for a moment, Elena feared the confrontation might escalate beyond anything Lord Reginald's diplomatic skills could smooth over. But instead, Lady Constance took a slow, measured breath, visibly reining in her anger, and when she spoke again, her voice had dropped into something colder and far more calculating. "Very well," she said. "If you insist on pursuing this course, Alistair, then I believe it is time the full truth of Miss Marsh's family history was made known to the entire court. not simply the sympathetic version you have chosen to share. There are details, I believe, that neither you nor she may be aware of. Details that paint a rather different picture of the friendship between her mother and yours. Elena's stomach dropped. What details? Lady Constance's gaze settled on her, with something close to satisfaction, as though she had been waiting for exactly this moment. My own mother served among the ladies of this court during the years your mother was here, Miss Marsh. She has told me stories over the years. Stories of a friendship that grew rather more complicated than simple companionship. Stories that suggest the reasons behind your mother's dismissal may not have been quite so straightforward as an unjust accusation of theft. You are suggesting something else happened, the Duke said, his voice carrying a warning edge. I am suggesting, Lady Constance said carefully, that perhaps it would be wise to learn the complete truth before rushing to publicly champion a woman whose history within this palace may hold more complexity than either of you currently understand. I do not say this to wound you, Miss Marsh. I say it because I believe you deserve to know the whole truth, just as much as the court does. With that, Lady Constance turned and swept away down the corridor, leaving Elena standing frozen, her mind racing with unwelcome questions she had not anticipated needing to ask. She glanced at the Duke, searching his face for reassurance, but found only the same troubled uncertainty that now churned within her own chest. She could be lying, the Duke said quietly, though his tone lacked full conviction. Constance is not above using half-truths to protect her own interests. But what if she is not lying? Elena asked. What if there is more to my mother's story than either of us knows? Lord Reginald, who had remained silent through the entire confrontation, finally spoke, his tone carefully measured. There is only one way to know for certain, Your Grace. I would suggest speaking with Mrs. Alden again, more thoroughly this time, and perhaps seeking out any other members of the old household who might remember those years clearly. If there is truth to be found, it is better we uncover it ourselves, before Lady Constance or anyone else has the chance to shape the story to their own advantage. The Duke nodded slowly, his expression grim with resolve. Elena, I am sorry. I did not anticipate this becoming quite so complicated, quite so quickly. Neither did I, Elena admitted, though beneath the anxiety building in her chest, a quieter, more determined resolve was beginning to take shape. Whatever the truth turned out to be, however complicated her mother's history within this palace might prove, she was no longer willing to let rumors and half-truths shape her understanding of her own family. She would find the answers herself, whatever they turned out to be, and she would face them honestly, just as her mother had always taught her to do. I want to speak with Mrs. Alden again, Elena said firmly. Tonight, if possible. I would rather know the complete truth now than live in uncertainty while the entire court whispers behind my back. The Duke studied her for a long moment, something like admiration flickering across his features despite the tension of the situation. I will arrange it, he said. And Elena, whatever we discover, I want you to know that it changes nothing about how I feel toward you. The truth, however complicated, cannot undo what has already grown between us. Elena wanted desperately to believe him, but as they made their way back through the palace corridors toward Mrs. Alden's quarters, Lady Constance's carefully chosen words echoed in her mind, a warning that the story she thought she understood about her own family might be far more complicated and far more painful than she had ever imagined. Mrs. Alden received them in her small quarters near the servants' wing, her expression growing solemn the moment she saw the troubled looks on both Elena's and the Duke's faces. She listened quietly, as Elena explained what Lady Constance had suggested, her weathered hands folding tightly in her lap as the story unfolded. I wondered if this day might come, Mrs. Alden said finally, her voice heavy with something that sounded almost like relief, as though a burden she had carried for many years was finally about to be set down. I did not tell you everything before, Miss Marsh, because I did not believe it was my place to share the complete story. But if Lady Constance intends to spread her own version of events, however distorted, then I believe you deserve to hear the truth from someone who was actually there. Elena sat forward, her heart pounding. Please, Mrs. Alden, I need to understand. The older woman drew a slow breath before continuing. Your mother and the Duke's mother, Lady Eleanor, were indeed close friends. Closer perhaps than was considered proper between a lady of the household and a seamstress in her employ. But their friendship, was not the scandal that Lady Constance's mother seems to have suggested over the years. It was something far simpler and far more painful than that. "What do you mean?" the Duke asked. "Lady Eleanor was deeply unhappy in her marriage to your father," Mrs. Alden said carefully, glancing at the Duke with obvious sympathy. "I do not say this to speak ill of a man long past, Your Grace. But it was well known among the staff that the marriage, arranged for political reasons, much like your own, was intended to be, brought your mother very little genuine happiness. Your mother found in Margaret a true friend, someone she could speak with honestly, without the careful pretense required among the nobility. That friendship, over time, became the target of jealousy among certain other members of the household, servants and nobles alike, who resented the closeness between a lady and a seamstress, that they felt overstepped proper boundaries." "So the accusations of theft," Elena said slowly, "they were fabricated out of jealousy, to separate my mother from Lady Eleanor?" "I believe so," Mrs. Alden said, "though I cannot prove it with certainty, as the years have carried away much of the evidence, and many of the people who might have testified to the truth. What I can tell you is that Lady Eleanor was devastated when your mother was dismissed. She argued fiercely on Margaret's behalf, more fiercely than I had ever seen her argue for anything, but the old Duke, under pressure from his advisors and eager to avoid further scandal, refused to reconsider the decision." The Duke's expression had grown increasingly troubled throughout Mrs. Alden's account, and when she finished, he sat in silence for a long moment, processing the weight of what he had just learned about parents he had lost so young. "My mother never recovered from that loss," he said quietly. "I remember, even as a small child, sensing a sadness in her that never fully lifted in the years before her own passing. I always assumed it was simply the nature of her marriage, the distance between her and my father. I never imagined it might have been tied to the loss of a friendship she valued so deeply." "I believe it was," Mrs. Alden said gently. "And I believe, Your Grace, that if Lady Eleanor could see what has unfolded these past few days, the return of Margaret's daughter to this palace, the beginning of a connection between you and Elena, that echoes the friendship she lost so unjustly, she would be overjoyed, rather than troubled by it." Elena felt tears gathering in her eyes, though this time they were not born of anxiety or uncertainty, but of a quiet, unexpected comfort. The truth, once she finally understood it fully, was not the scandal Lady Constance had implied, but a story of genuine friendship torn apart by jealousy and rigid expectation. A story that made the strange, fated connection between Elena and the Duke feel less like coincidence and more like something meant to heal a wound that had gone unaddressed for far too long. "Thank you, Mrs. Alden," Elena said softly, "for telling us the truth, even when it would have been easier to stay silent." "You are welcome, my dear," Mrs. Alden said, reaching out to gently pat Elena's hand. "I only wish I had spoken sooner, so that Lady Constance could not have used the uncertainty to cause you such worry." As they left Mrs. Alden's quarters, the Duke turned to Elena with a renewed determination in his eyes, the earlier uncertainty replaced by something far more resolute. "I intend to address the entire court tomorrow," he said. "I will share the true history between our families, correct the injustice done to your mother once and for all, and make my intentions toward you clear, publicly, and without further delay. I am tired of allowing rumor and half-truths to shape the story of something I know, in my heart, to be genuine." Elena's chest tightened with a mixture of hope and lingering fear. The court may not accept it, even with the truth laid bare. Lady Constance will not simply step aside because of an old story about our mother's friendship. "Perhaps not," the Duke admitted, "but I would rather face their disapproval honestly than continue living a life shaped entirely by arrangements I never chose. Elena, I have thought carefully about this these past days, and I am certain of what I want. I want to formally set aside the arrangement with Lady Constance, whatever difficulty that decision brings, and I want to court you openly, as the woman I have come to care for deeply, not as some echo of a childhood memory, or a means of correcting old family wrongs." Elena's breath caught at the sincerity in his voice, at the weight of what he was proposing, the enormous risk it carried for both of them. "Are you certain?" she asked. "Once this is done, there will be no easy way to undo it. The whole region will know." "I am certain," the Duke said, taking her hand gently in his own, a gesture far more intimate than anything he had allowed himself since they first met in the courtyard. "I have spent my entire life certain of very little that was truly my own choice. This, Elena, choosing you, openly and honestly, is the first decision I have made in years that feels entirely mine." That evening, word spread quickly through the palace that the Duke intended to address the full court the following morning, and though no one outside his closest advisors knew exactly what he planned to say, the atmosphere throughout the palace crackled with anticipation and uncertainty in equal measure. Lady Constance, upon hearing the news, retreated to her chambers without further confrontation, though Elena suspected the calm was merely the quiet before whatever storm tomorrow's gathering might bring. Elena spent the last hours of that evening with her mother, who had been given temporary quarters within the palace, while the details of her formal restoration were being arranged. She told Margaret everything Mrs. Alden had shared, watching her mother's careful composure finally crack under the weight of 2 decades of unspoken grief and vindication. "I always wondered," Margaret said softly, tears streaming freely down her face for the first time since Elena had brought her into this strange new chapter of their lives, "if Eleanor ever knew the truth of what happened to me, if she ever tried to help. It comforts me more than I can say, to learn that she fought for me, even if her efforts were not enough to change the outcome." "Tomorrow, the whole court will know the truth," Elena said, taking her mother's hands in her own. "Whatever happens next, you will finally have the vindication you deserved all those years ago." As Elena finally retired to her own chamber that night, her mind buzzing with anticipation and lingering nerves about what tomorrow's gathering might bring, she found herself, for the first time since that fateful morning behind the hedge, feeling something close to genuine hope, a fragile but growing certainty that whatever challenges still lay ahead, she would not face them alone. The great hall of the palace had never held so many people at once, or so Elena thought as she stood at the edge of the assembled crowd the following morning, watching nobles from every corner of the region file into rows of seats beneath banners of gold and deep blue. Word of the Duke's intended announcement had spread far beyond the palace walls overnight, and by the time the ceremony was set to begin, the hall overflowed with curious nobility, palace staff, and even a handful of common folk who had somehow managed to secure entry, drawn by rumors of a scandal too extraordinary to miss. Elena stood near the front, beside her mother, both of them dressed simply but neatly, in gowns Prudence had helped prepare that morning. Margaret's hand trembled slightly in her daughter's grip, though her expression remained composed, dignified in a way that reminded Elena, with a fresh pang of admiration, of exactly the kind of woman who could have earned the genuine friendship of a duchess so many years ago. Lord Reginald stood near the platform, his expression unreadable as always, though Elena thought she caught a flicker of something like approval in his eyes when he glanced her way. Lady Constance sat in a place of honor near the front, her posture rigid, her expression carefully composed into polished neutrality, though the tension in her shoulders betrayed the storm Elena suspected was building beneath the surface. The trumpets sounded, and the hall fell silent, as Duke Alistair Whitmore stepped onto the platform, dressed once again in the formal blue coat he had worn during his investiture, though this time his expression carried none of the distant weariness Elena had first noticed. Instead, he stood tall and resolute, his eyes sweeping across the assembled crowd, with a quiet confidence that seemed to still every whispered conversation before it could even begin. "Thank you all for gathering on such short notice," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed hall. "I know many of you have questions about the events of recent days, about the young woman who so unexpectedly delayed my investiture, and about the rumors that have followed in the time since. I intend to answer those questions honestly and completely before this entire court." He recounted, with careful clarity, the story of the frozen pond from his childhood, of the girl who had saved him and vanished without a name, of the strange and undeniable feeling that had overtaken him the moment he saw Elena's face across the courtyard. He spoke of Margaret Marsh, of her years of faithful service within this very palace, of the friendship she had shared with his own mother, and of the unjust accusations that had torn that friendship apart and driven a good woman from her rightful place. A murmur swept through the crowd as he spoke, nobles turning to whisper urgently to one another, though the Duke pressed on without pause, his voice growing firmer with each passing sentence. "I have spoken with those who witnessed these events firsthand," he continued, "and I am satisfied, beyond any reasonable doubt, that Margaret Marsh was innocent of the accusations that led to her dismissal from this household nearly 20 years ago. As the current Duke of this region, I hereby formally restore her name and reputation, and I extend to her, and to her daughter, the full honor and respect that should never have been taken from her in the first place." Margaret's grip on Elena's hand tightened, tears streaming silently down her face, as 2 decades of unspoken injustice were finally, publicly corrected, before the very court that had once turned its back on her. The Duke paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the hall before continuing, his gaze finding Elena's across the crowded room. "There is one more matter I wish to address today," he said, "a matter of far greater personal significance to me than even the correction of an old injustice." The hall fell utterly silent, every eye now fixed on the Duke, sensing that whatever he was about to say would carry consequences far beyond anything discussed thus far. "For years," he continued, "my life has been shaped by arrangements made on my behalf, decisions of duty and obligation that left little room for choices of my own heart. I have honored those arrangements faithfully, believing them necessary for the stability and prosperity of this region. But in recent days, I have come to understand that true stability cannot be built on obligation alone. It must also be built on honesty, and on genuine connection between those who lead this region and the people they serve." He stepped down from the platform, and a collective gasp rippled through the crowd as he walked, not toward Lady Constance seated in her place of honor, but toward Elena, standing quietly beside her mother near the edge of the gathered nobility. "I am formally setting aside the arranged alliance between my family and Lady Constance's," he announced, his voice carrying clearly, even as murmurs of shock spread rapidly through the hall. "This decision was not made lightly, and I recognize the difficulty it creates, for the agreements our families have long maintained. I intend to work personally and diligently to ensure the continued strength of our alliance with Lady Constance's territory through other means that do not require a marriage neither of us truly desired." Lady Constance's expression, for the briefest moment, betrayed something raw and unguarded, though she quickly composed herself, rising from her seat with practiced grace, even as the entire hall watched her reaction with undisguised curiosity. "And," the Duke continued, now standing directly before Elena, close enough that she could see the quiet vulnerability beneath his steady composure, "I intend to court Elena Marsh openly, honestly, and with the full knowledge, and, I hope, eventual blessing of this court. Not because of an old childhood memory, and not because of any debt owed to her family, but because in the short time I have known her, she has shown me more honesty, more courage, and more genuine warmth than I have found in years of carefully arranged court life." Elena felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her, the same overwhelming sensation she had felt crouching behind the hedge just days earlier, though this time she did not wish to disappear. She lifted her chin, meeting the Duke's gaze steadily, and found in his eyes the same searching, hopeful expression she had first glimpsed across the courtyard, though now it carried none of the uncertainty, only quiet, resolute conviction. "I know this is not the story any of you expected when you gathered here today," the Duke said, addressing the hall once more, though his eyes remained on Elena. "I know it defies the careful order this court has long relied upon, but I would rather lead this region with an honest heart than a carefully arranged one, and I hope, in time, you will come to understand and even welcome that choice." The hall remained silent for a long, suspended moment, the weight of the Duke's words settling over the assembled nobility, like a held breath finally released. Then, slowly, from somewhere near the back of the hall, a single voice began to clap, followed by another, and another, until a wave of applause swept through the crowd, hesitant at first but growing steadily stronger, carried along by the common folk who had slipped into the gathering, and who saw, in this moment, something far more meaningful than mere scandal, a genuine story of fairness restored, and love chosen freely, rather than arranged out of cold necessity. Elena stepped forward, closing the distance between herself and the Duke, and reached out to take his offered hand before the entire court, no longer hiding, no longer uncertain of her place, but standing openly and proudly beside the man whose life had become so unexpectedly and irrevocably entwined with her own. "Whatever comes next," the Duke said quietly, meant only for her, though his voice carried just enough for those nearest to hear. "I am glad it began with you hiding behind a hedge, refusing to miss a ceremony you were never invited to attend. Elena laughed softly, the tension of the past several days finally beginning to ease from her shoulders. I am glad too, Your Grace. Alistair, he corrected gently, a genuine smile spreading across his features. Please, just Alistair. Alistair, Elena repeated softly, testing the name, finding it fit far more comfortably than any title ever could. As the applause continued to swell around them, and as her mother watched with tears of joy, finally replacing decades of quiet sorrow, Elena understood, with a certainty she had never expected to feel, that the frightened girl who had slipped through a service gate just days earlier, hoping only for a fleeting glimpse of royal grandeur, had found something far greater than she had ever imagined possible, a place of her own, earned not through title or birth, but through honesty, courage, and the simple, unshakable truth of a connection that had waited patiently across the years to finally be recognized. The story of the girl who hid to watch a royal ceremony, and the Duke who halted everything the moment he noticed her, would be told and retold throughout Ashbourne for years to come, not as a scandal whispered behind closed doors, but as a reminder that even the most carefully arranged lives could be transformed by a single, unexpected moment of genuine connection, and that sometimes, the most important ceremonies are not the ones planned by tradition, but the ones written quietly by fate itself.